Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's presentation, Did Wolves Really Save Yellowstone?, is brought to you by wildlife biologist and NatHab expedition leader Aaron Bott. Aaron is a wildlife biologist and doctoral student at Utah State University, where he studies wolves across America's West to help promote coexistence between humans and carnivores. With deep roots in the Mountain West dating back to the mid-1800s, Aaron brings both the expertise of a scientist and the intimate knowledge of a true local to his guiding. He spent over 15 years as a naturalist and wilderness guide throughout the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and Colorado Plateau. Aaron, we really appreciate you jumping in and being here with us today. The show is yours. Take it away, my friend.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in today. I'm excited to be discussing this fascinating subject, which gets a lot of attention, and it deserves a lot of attention. It's a pretty exciting thing. Most of us are interested in wolves and the impacts they have on ecosystems. I'm assuming that that's why many of you tuned in today. A lot of us are probably familiar with the history of wolves being absent from the Yellowstone landscape for many decades before they were formally reintroduced in the mid-1990s, excuse me. And many of us have perhaps even been to Yellowstone and seen wolves, and it's a really beautiful landscape. It's a wonderful place to study and understand and appreciate more about the natural world in which we live. Today, as I was so generously introduced, I'm going to be talking about wolves on the Yellowstone landscape specifically. Wolves are a remarkable and charismatic species, and I work as a wolf biologist. It's the species that I've studied the most in my career, and have had a wonderful opportunity to monitor them in the Northern Rocky Mountain states as well as elsewhere, including graduate work, which I did in Yellowstone National Park under the supervision of the park's staff biologist there, and have had a wonderful opportunity to also attend graduate school, working with some of the world's leading wolf experts studying predator-prey relationships, specifically in northern Yellowstone. So without further ado, I've got a lot to talk about today, and we will jump right into it. So as was mentioned, I'm a wolf biologist, and I study and monitor wolf populations across the American West. Some of the ways that I do this is by live capturing wolves and marking them with radio collars in order to study their movements, as well as taking biodata such as blood samples and tissue samples for us to better understand the health of the individual animals, as well as genetic connectivity and diet. This is a fascinating part of my work, and it's, like I said, something that I specialize in. And in this photograph here, it's just an example of my work day, I guess. This wolf is alive and well. She's just been anesthetized and is about to be fitted with a radio collar, and she's actually out and about running around today. I'm still monitoring her and trying to understand more about her social behavior. We do this as scientists because wolves are very controversial, and they have been controversial for a long time. Humans have a complex relationship with large carnivores all across the globe, and we have for a long time, especially since the agricultural revolution, which took place 10,000 plus years ago. As humans began to adopt livestock husbandry practices, our relationships with these large carnivores has been strained in many instances throughout history, and tolerance for large carnivores has dwindled over the centuries. And so it's very important for us as a society to have a correct understanding of what large carnivores are and what they do, in order for us to have a realistic perception on how they fit into the natural world. And as a scientist, I really emphasize the importance of collecting data and studying species so that our understanding of the facts can influence our decision making and hopefully increase our tolerance for large carnivores like wolves. Because if we don't have the facts, then our imaginations just run wild, and we can very easily fall into that cycle, which we have fallen into in the past, where we see the natural world as something that it isn't, and we take advantage of it. And in some cases, like with large carnivores, we even try and eradicate those pieces of the system which are so essential to making everything stay healthy and connected on the landscape. So that's what I do. I work as a scientist, and I work among many genius scientists, really smart and dedicated people working with wolves and other species on the landscape in order to, again, better understand our place in the natural world and understand how these other species also fit into the system. So as a scientist working with large carnivores, especially wolves, the number one question that we are generally interested in, and that the public is interested in, is how wolves interact with their environment. Everyone knows that wolves are large carnivores, they eat meat, but there's a lot of concern or interest in how wolves impact their prey. Humans like to eat meat, just like wolves like to eat meat, and so there's sincere interest and, again, curiosity, but as well as concern regarding how wolves impact not only livestock, but also native ungulates or hooved animals like deer and elk. And we're fascinated in how that system works as well. And so one of the primary objectives of studying wolves is to look and see how they interact with their environment. And Yellowstone has been the premier location on the globe in understanding and observing how wolves engage with the landscape and engage with the environment that they live on. And we're going to explore that today. And in order to explore it and to appreciate it, we need to do a little bit of background first. We're going to talk very briefly about wolf biology, as well as elk biology. Elk are the primary prey species for wolves in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And so we need to understand a little bit about their biology as well as the biology of wolves. And then we have to take a quick detour down history lane in order to understand the complexity of wolves and humans and elk in the Yellowstone area. So bear with me before we go any further down into the impacts of wolves on their environment. We're going to take a detour, like I said. So the wolf is the largest wild member of the dog family. It's known as Canis lupus among scientists. It's commonly referred to as the gray wolf, although not all wolves are gray, such as this beautiful animal taken in this picture by Ronan Donovan, who's a good friend of mine. Sometimes they're called timber wolves, but ultimately Canis lupus is a very dynamic species which historically has lived all over the northern hemisphere. The same species can be found in Eurasia as well as North America. On average in Yellowstone, wolves are about 100 pounds. Males are larger than females, so 110 pounds in the winter is where many male wolves will be. Female wolves will be 80 to 90 pounds. There's a lot of seasonal fluctuation regarding wolf weight and how that influences their mass. Wolves reproduce just once a year. They typically have a litter of 6 pups that are born in the middle of April. About half of those pups typically survive till the end of the calendar year, and that's just because newborn baby animals have a hard time surviving in the wild. It's not specifically wolves where we see high infant mortality. It's among all species, deer and elk and bears included. It's tough being a baby animal. But 6 pups on average born to a litter. And wolves don't live that long, surprisingly. We typically see them living 2 to 5 years. They can live up to 12 years, like a big dog, but it's very difficult being a wolf. And in Yellowstone, it's actually a bit higher. It's about 3 to 5 years old is the average lifespan of a wolf. Wolves can obviously be killed by humans, which reduces their lifespan, but wolves are also very intra-specifically aggressive towards one another. That means that wolves like to fight and defend their territories, which can lead to mortality. So wolves killing wolves. And then there are other things that can kill you on the landscape too, including your dinner if you're a wolf. About a 100-pound wolf chasing an elk, which is much larger than itself, can easily be injured, and that injury can then result in a loss of life. So yeah, wolves don't live typically too long. And then obviously wolves are carnivores, so they eat meat. Elk, Cervus canadensis, are members of the deer family. They're the second largest species in the deer family in North America, moose. Elk can range in body size and weight from about 400 pounds to up to 900 pounds. For some of those bulls, females are smaller than the males. Males are the only ones that grow those large, magnificent antlers that are so impressive. They shed those antlers every year in the spring, only to grow them again as a secondary sexual characteristic, which helps them to compete for mating. They have typically one calf once a year, born in June, and they raise that calf until they successfully can reproduce again the following year. And elk generally live 12 to 20 years old. A 20-year-old elk is a pretty dang old elk. And obviously elk are herbivores, so they eat plants. So those are our key players in our narrative. And now to set the setting or the landscape of our narrative, Yellowstone is the world's first national park. It's situated in northwestern Wyoming, southwestern Montana, and southeastern Idaho. It's a part of what we call the Northern Rocky Mountains, which basically runs from there in northwestern Wyoming all the way up through to Jasper and even to the base of the Yukon. This impressive mountain range of high elevated plateaus. It's most famous for its geothermal features, which is how it became a national park. It was first created as a national park in 1872. So it was, again, the world's first national park. We established it well before we even had a National Park Service. The National Park Service wasn't created until 1916. So that's about 50 years of having a national park without having a designated federal branch of the government to monitor and to take care of the national park itself. And that's going to be important in our story because it's going to explain how our management of the park has changed over the decades. Now, if you haven't been to Yellowstone, or even if you have, it's important to know that 80% of Yellowstone is a thick coniferous forest, primarily made up of lodgepole pine trees. This is a very uniform forest. Lodgepole pine trees grow with shallow roots, and they do pretty decently in a very rhyolitic soil, which is a volcanic soil. Because of the geothermal activity, there is not a lot of great soil that vegetation can thrive off of across the Yellowstone Plateau, at least across most of the plateau. And this is important to realize because many times people look out at Yellowstone like this and they think, wow, what a wilderness. There's got to be bears and wolves and moose and elk all through those woods. But in reality, it's a bit of a desert. It's a large coniferous forest desert. A uniform stand like that doesn't generate a lot of biodiversity. And again, lodgepole pine trees are not particularly nutritious. Not a lot of sunlight reaches the forest floor, so there's not a lot of sedges and grasses for browsers and grazers to eat upon. And therefore, you don't have a lot of predators in the thick part of the forest. So even though we think of Yellowstone as this large wilderness that is suitable habitat for wildlife, in actuality, a lot of Yellowstone doesn't support high biodiversity just because of, again, the uniformity of its thick forest. However, there is an exception. In northeastern Yellowstone, in a place that we refer to as the Northern Range, we have subtle montane valleys where we have large rivers cutting through the landscape. And because of rain shadow effect in northeastern Yellowstone National Park, this area receives relatively less snow, less moisture, but a lot of rivers, and it works as a kind of a withholding or a refuge holding for water. In this location where the elevation is also less than on the interior of the plateau, we do have fantastic wildlife habitat. Not only is there flowing water, but you have mixed coniferous forests, and you also have wide open valleys that provide a lot of vegetation for herbivores. And along the riverbanks, you have nutritional species to consume like willows and aspen and cottonwoods, deciduous plants, woody plants that contain more nitrogen and are more nutritious than a lot of the coniferous plants that make up the majority of the interior of the park. So this northern range is where most people go to see wildlife. It really is the American Serengeti. It's where most people associate wildlife viewing in North America, with this large valley, which is made up of an area known as Little America, as well as Lamar Valley. And this is where we see a lot of wolves. If you go to Yellowstone, you're going to spend a lot of time looking for wildlife here in this section of the park. Here's a map that illustrates Yellowstone's boundary. You can see it's a bit of a rectangle with some odds and ends sticking out of it to the north and to the east. But that highlighted area is the northern range there up at the top of the map there. And those arrows are showing the migration routes of elk from the northern herd. Now, elk are, as I mentioned, a common species which are found all across the northern Rocky Mountains. In Yellowstone National Park, they are very abundant, and there are approximately 7 herds that live scattered across the park. But in the northern part of the park, we have our largest herd, and that is reasonably enough referred to as the northern elk herd, or the northern range elk herd. And this population, because of its visibility, has been the most studied elk herd in the world. And it's this area of the park that our story is going to be focusing on. So you can see in that map that the northern range goes actually beyond Yellowstone's northern boundary, up above Gardner and into the state of Montana. So we're going to be talking about this whole area. Now, to focus a little bit more on the history of Yellowstone, when Yellowstone was first created as a national park, there was no park service, and people weren't exactly sure how a national park should be managed or what it should be managed for. And so in the early days of Yellowstone, hunting was actually allowed in the park. It wasn't until more squatters and settlers began to set up camps and build cabins and communities and operate as outfitters, hunting outfitters, in the park and outside of the park, that hunting became banned within the park's boundaries. But even then, in the 1880s and in the 1890s, poaching was a massive issue, because there was, again, no park service to monitor what was actually taking place in the park. Ultimately, the Army was sent out to help patrol the park, but this was, again, a time where Yellowstone did not have any infrastructure, and you were stationed in the backcountry to patrol and look for poachers, but the laws of catching a poacher and the consequences were pretty toothless. There was no jail sentence. All you could do is escort poachers to the boundary of the park and kick them out and hope that they didn't come back. And things were pretty lawless. And at this time, market hunting was just coming to its climax. market hunting is a time in our American history where people were killing animals in great numbers to sell to the hide markets and to the meat markets. And we have documented a great wanton slaughter of wildlife around Yellowstone National Park, but also in Yellowstone National Park in the late 19th century. And this decimated a lot of our ungulate populations or herbivore populations. Bison became very few, and in fact, all across the lower 48 states, really the only remaining population that was left was a group of about a couple of dozen just north of Yellowstone Lake that were taking refuge there. The elk populations also crashed, and again, this was all due to market hunting and poaching. And it wasn't really until the dawn of the 20th century that we finally were able to get a handle on this and get the poaching to finally stop and shut down the market hunting operations. But in the early 20th century, with much concern about our diminished herbivore populations, our bison and our elk and our deer populations, the sentiment towards predators was never popular. And because folks favored trying to help increase the herbivores like your bison and your deer and your elk, as well as for other conflict reasons with livestock outside of the park, government bounties and predator eradication programs were initiated in the early 20th century. Specifically from 1915 to 1935, local and federal governments initiated a program to completely eradicate large carnivores essentially from the continent. And we were very successful at removing wolves across the country, as well as mountain lions. Bears were also targeted, coyotes were targeted, but they remained resilient. And this predator eradication program took place, like I said, inside Yellowstone. So in Yellowstone National Park, wolves and mountain lions were targeted and were systematically eradicated from the park in order to promote higher abundances of our deer and elk and bison populations. The last wolves that were trapped and killed in Yellowstone National Park were taken out in 1926. So there were essentially no viable populations of wolves within Yellowstone National Park after the 1930s. And mountain lions were also completely exterminated from the park at that time. And that's going to be an important part of our story later on. So remember that. Bears, grizzly bears specifically, dwindled in number. Grizzly bears, in many ways, are the opposite of wolves, because wolves can reproduce quickly. They are biologically resilient in many ways. Grizzly bears reproduce very slowly. And so it didn't take a lot of killing of bears for their population to become alarmingly low, although most of the grizzly bear population declines took place later on in the 1960s, actually in the early 1970s. Well, after the removal of your poachers and your market hunters and a ban on hunting in Yellowstone National Park, as well as predator eradication efforts, elk, the remaining elk that were there, suddenly had a heyday. They literally lived within a protected landscape where they had no fear of predation by any species, human or otherwise. And elk are also pretty fecund. They can reproduce relatively quickly, and with a landscape that was fresh and prime, the elk population very quickly began to rebound. And they rebounded so quickly that as early as the mid-1930s, the Park Service became concerned about an overabundance of elk on the landscape. And so the Park Service began to cull elk from Yellowstone's northern range. As the elk population got so numerous, helicopters were sent in annually to remove elk from the population. Many of these elk were shipped off and translocated to other states where elk had been exterminated. So many elk populations found across the lower 48 states today can trace their roots back to Yellowstone National Park as part of early translocation efforts in order to help build up our nation's elk populations again. We also brought elk into Canada and into a couple of other different countries that were looking for elk translocations. Hunting was also permissible, sometimes within the park in order to cull growing elk herds. And from 1935 to 1968, over 70,000 elk were removed from Yellowstone National Park. That's a lot of elk, and that's a lot of money and time and effort spent in trying to keep a handle on the growing number of elk on the landscape so that they wouldn't degrade the habitat and cause damage to the landscape. Now, this all changed in 1969 when Yellowstone National Park, as well as other national parks, adopted a policy known as natural regulation. So again, and I've given some presentations on Yellowstone's history before with natural habitat adventures, but Yellowstone is fascinating in many ways, but one of the ways it's fascinating is because it is the world's first national park. We have kind of used this idea of a national park as an experiment with Yellowstone. We haven't really known what to do with ourselves in terms of how we manage national parks, and we've had to go through some growing pains in order to understand what exactly we hope to get out of a national park. And so in the case of Yellowstone, in the beginning, it was, like I said, a bit lawless, and we even permitted hunting within the park. Later on, we were focusing mostly on the enjoyment of the public. So we tried to emphasize a lot of hands-on manipulation of the national park to make it more like Disneyland, if I dare say, really enjoyable for the public. But in the 1960s, 1963 actually, with the Starker-Leopold report, there was a push with the environmental movement to protect national parks as a vignette of primitive America and to allow the natural world to regulate what is happening in the park rather than be so heavily hands-on in the national park. So in 1969, one of the things that we stopped doing in Yellowstone is we stopped worrying about removing elk from the landscape. The idea was we'll let nature take care of itself. Yes, the elk population will grow, but eventually they will hit a threshold. They'll hit a carrying capacity and they will simply run out of food, and that will itself manage the number of elk on the landscape. So that was the idea. But here you can see on this graph that right there where I've got my bright red arrow shooting straight up, that is the indicator of what happened in 1969 after we stopped manually removing elk from the landscape. The elk population skyrocketed. It shot up exponentially over the next couple of decades. Again, Yellowstone is a protected area. There's no human hunting, but there's also no predators on the landscape, or very few predators, primarily just black bears and the odd grizzly bear, as well as coyotes. And so the elk population grows and grows and grows until finally in the early 1990s, our population estimates for one herd, for the northern elk herd itself, was above 19,000 up to 21,000 elk. And that's in one herd. That's not the entire population across the national park. That is only the northern range elk herd. That is a lot of elk. If you've been to Yellowstone on one of these trips, if you've been to the National Elk Refuge just south of Yellowstone, outside of Jackson, you've probably seen those thousands of elk as they migrate down into the Teton Valley. To put that into perspective, on average, they typically have 7,000 to 9,000 elk within that valley. And so you can compare that visually, if you've been there, to the 19,000 to 21,000 elk that were found in northern Yellowstone. So that is a lot of elk that people are seeing. And as the elk population got that high, more and more critics concerned about the stability of the ecosystem began to ask, are there too many elk? Are there too many elk? Too many is an interesting way to phrase a question, because it really has to do with human values. If you really like elk, you might be satisfied that there are that many elk on the landscape. But what we're really trying to ask here is, are there negative impacts by having this many elk on the landscape? Is it causing negative effects to other species in the system because of the overabundance of elk? Is this a natural carrying capacity or an unnatural carrying capacity? Well, elk generally are grazers that like to eat grasses and sedges, but they can also be browsers and eat woody plants as well. And as I showed you earlier, northern Yellowstone has some beautiful rivers running through its montane valleys. And along these riparian, or these river systems, you have woody vegetation like quaking aspens, cottonwoods, and willows. And these deciduous high elevation plants contain a lot of nitrogen, which is great for a building block for proteins. It's very nutritious. And as more and more elk were present on the landscape, we began to notice that there was a diminishing supply of aspens and cottonwoods and willows along the riverbanks. These willows and these aspens and these cottonwoods, because they're so nutritionally valuable, they create biological hotspots where we see more biodiversity along riparian areas than we typically do anywhere else in the surrounding ecosystem. So they're very sensitive and they're very rich in biodiversity. But when you start to remove those vegetations, those plants, then the habitat begins to degrade and we lose biodiversity. And as we had so many elk on the landscape, they began to overbrowse and overgraze on the landscape and basically denude it of its nutritional value. And this was very disturbing because it's unhealthy and unsustainable for the elk themselves. Ultimately, their population will start to crash. The elk become weaker. They become, although abundant, they become skinny. They're hungry. They're nutritionally deprived because they're competing with one another so aggressively for the remaining nutritional value of the landscape. But it's also removing, again, these very sensitive, nutritionally rich, biodiverse niches that many other species depend on as well. And this is all because of the abundance of elk that were on the landscape. And as was phrased by one of Yellowstone's scientists, these overabundant elk were simply eating the cereal spring, summer, and fall, and in the winter they were eating the box, leaving nothing on the landscape and completely denuding it of, again, all nutritional value and forage for other wildlife and habitat for other wildlife as well. So this is what the field looked like in the early 1900s. A lot of elk, and if you wanted to see elk, you went to Yellowstone. It was the place to go. But in the mid-1990s, along came our second primary character in this story, the gray wolf, Canis lupus. I have given a lot of webinars for Natural Habitat about the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone, so I'm going to very briefly just touch on some of the important facts for today's story. Again, wolves had been completely eradicated from the northern Rocky Mountain states due to human persecution. And in the early 1970s, 1974, wolves were listed as a regionally extinct species, an endangered species, on the Endangered Species Act. And plans went underway to try and figure out where wolves could be reintroduced and restored to parts of their former range. And central Idaho, northwestern Montana, and Yellowstone National Park were identified as 3 locations where wolves could be reintroduced. And after a lot of debate and a lot of complexity, a total of 66 wolves over 2 years, 1995 and 1996, were live captured in Alberta and British Columbia and were reintroduced into the Northern Rockies. 31 of those 66 wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park, into the park's northern range. Now, this was done because of the natural regulation policy that I touched on in the late 1960s. There was very little comprehension of what the possible ecological benefits would be to having wolves on the landscape. It was more, to be frank, it was more initiated as an ethical move. Wolves had been removed from the landscape by humans. Yellowstone was one of the places that could support wolves if they were reintroduced, and in a national park, it was the right thing to do to bring back a native species that had been eradicated. So that was the primary purpose of reintroducing wolves. And as I said, 31 wolves in 1995 and 1996 were reintroduced into northern Yellowstone National Park. After the reintroduction, over the next 10 years, the elk population in northern Yellowstone took a significant decline. It decreased by almost 80% over just about 10 years, from 1995 to 2005 up until 2010. The population dropped radically. With fewer elk on the landscape, scientists as well as the public began to note a resurgence in some of the riparian zones around northern Yellowstone. Willows began to grow again. Aspen trees and stands began to seemingly repopulate and recover. And with this resurgence of habitat, we also had songbirds coming back to these sensitive riparian areas. Beavers began to swim upstream. Amphibians and cutthroat trout and other aquatic species began to come back onto the landscape, which in turn influenced larger wildlife like moose. All of this was noted in the first 20 years after Yellowstone reintroduced wolves. And this was seen and observed, like I said, in northern Yellowstone, but was made popular by a publication that came out from Ripple and Bersta in 2012, documenting the changes that they're seeing on the Yellowstone landscape. And they attributed this to wolf reintroduction, noting that there have been significant changes during the first 15 years after Yellowstone's reintroduction. And they began to hypothesize that some of these changes were more than just coincidental, that they occurred during the same time that an apex predator had been returned to a landscape after having been absent for many decades. To pause just for a second, the term trophic cascade is one that I'm going to use a lot here, and it's also one that you may have heard of before. Trophic cascade is a term that scientists and biologists and ecologists use to help explain the impacts that species can have not only directly on neighboring species, but also on their environment or their ecosystem. Specifically with wolves, we're talking about how predators can directly and indirectly impact their environment. In its very simplest form, wolves are predators that impact their prey, elk, directly by hunting them, pursuing them, and capturing and killing them. But indirectly, they can impact the ecosystem because by influencing the movements and behavior of elk, as well as the abundance of elk, they're going to indirectly impact the vegetation in the ecosystem as well. So it's a cascading effect that we refer to as a trophic cascade. Different trophic levels in the ecosystem and cascading effects. This is a top-down cascading effect in this situation. So with the popularity of wolves being reintroduced to Yellowstone, people really enjoying traveling to Yellowstone, ecotourism thriving, and suddenly a very obvious resurgence of some of the biodiversity in these sensitive riparian areas, narrative began to pop up suggesting that wolves saved Yellowstone National Park. That because of the reintroduction of wolves, the ecosystem had been brought back into a stable equilibrium. The natural order of things were back in place, and biodiversity was on the rise. And again, this was all in part, or this is all due to the reintroduction of wolves. And this very popular narrative is still told and talked about very often today. But my question that I'm going to be hopefully breaching with you today is, did wolves actually save Yellowstone? What role did they play in ultimately the decline of the northern elk herd in Yellowstone National Park? It is well observed that an overabundance of elk were the cause of habitat degradation and a declining biodiversity. And with a decline in elk abundance, biodiversity again increased. So another way of phrasing this question, did wolves save Yellowstone, is, are wolves the primary cause of the elk decline? Fewer elk means more biodiversity on the landscape, but are wolves, specifically 31 wolves reintroduced, are they the sole cause of this change in dynamics on the landscape? Well, in order to understand this, we have to look at a few different things. One is additive and compensatory predation. Those are two fancy scientific words that basically summarize how we examine which individuals can be most important to a population. In a nutshell, if you're going to divide your elk up into three groups, you have your young, your prime-aged, fertile reproducers, and then you have your old elk. If you want to slow down population growth, the group that you need to target and reduce are your breeders, the ones that are actively reproducing. As I touched on earlier with wolves, young or offspring, newborn calves, don't have particularly high survival rates because life is just tough. And when we have a lot of young animals dying from either starvation, birthing complications, or predators, or weather complexities, that is a part of the natural system and is known as compensatory because it's ultimately not impacting the overall population. Your older group of elk in this situation are not actively reproducing. They're not contributing to the population growth. I guess the perhaps simplistic way of looking at this is, if you had an island and you had 10 females and 1 male, at the end of the year, you can expect to have 10 calves. But if you were to flip that on its head and have 10 males and 1 female, at the end of the year, you're only going to have 1 calf, right? So it's your ratio, particularly of breeding females, which is most important to controlling your population growth. So if wolves are going to be impacting the elk population significantly enough to cause its decline by up to 80%, then they have to be targeting primarily your prime-aged cow elk, the reproducing, breeding females of your population. But when we look at wolf biology and their predation patterns, we begin to understand that wolves have many limitations as predators. In fact, their success rates in killing elk are pretty dismal compared to other predators on the landscape. Wolves kill elk and have success rates of about 20% when calves are included, but when you're only looking at adult elk, you're looking at below 10% success rates for wolves pursuing and killing elk. Again, one of the reasons why this is simply because elk are bigger and they're badder and they're tough. And wolves often are going into high-risk situations when they are pursuing elk and trying to capture their dinner. Wolves can go weeks without eating because the circumstances aren't quite right for them to be able to capture and successfully bring down their prey. They depend on a lot of things. One is, going back to this previous slide, the encounter rates of how often they're bumping into their prey and how versus how often they have to seek for their prey, and the vulnerability of the prey. And prey vulnerability depends on multiple things. It can depend upon the age of the animal. It can depend upon the health and the condition of the animal. It can also depend upon the topography that the animal is hunted in. If there's deep snow and the animal makes a wrong turn or missteps, that stumble could be the last mistake that that elk is going to make, regardless of its health and its age. But more often than not, what you're going to find is that wolves inevitably are going to be targeting the young, the old, and the sick. And again, that's based off of just their physical limitations as large carnivores. Wolves hunt by chasing their prey, and they have to capture their prey with their teeth and wrestle it to the ground. And this is risky and it's challenging. You compare that to mountain lions or felids, your cats, which are solitary ambush predators. And they have specialized equipment like retracting claws that help them to grab onto their prey. And they subdue their prey very quickly by having a more powerful bite force that they deliver to the neck, to the windpipe, and they can therefore have success rates of capturing and killing their prey by up to 50% and even 60% in some systems. So mountain lions are one example of a very efficient predator versus wolves, which as dogs spend a lot of time and energy trying to select their prey. Now, on the landscape too, we have bison, which are in Yellowstone National Park, but bison are obviously much larger and more dangerous to hunt than elk. A male bison is around 2,000 pounds. Females are around 1,000 pounds. Behaviorally, they're different. They typically don't flee from their pursuers, from predators like wolves. They stand their ground, whereas elk gather up in herds and they do flee, which makes them an easier target. And so although we have bison on the Yellowstone landscape, it's typically elk which we see targeted more frequently because simply they're safer to catch. So now we have a better understanding of wolf predation patterns on elk and some of the limitations that they biologically have as they pursue elk. It's important for us to also acknowledge that there are other players on the Yellowstone landscape besides wolves. Most notably, grizzly bears are, in many cases, the dominant apex predator on the Yellowstone landscape. Grizzly bears, as I mentioned earlier, declined in their population in the 60s and 70s, and they were listed as a threatened species. But what is often overlooked in the Yellowstone wolf-elk narrative is that during the years prior to and during wolf reintroduction, the grizzly bear population recovered by threefold, and a larger grizzly bear population on the landscape increased grizzly bear predation on elk, as well as having wolves return to the landscape. Grizzly bears, as well as black bears, which we don't have an accurate number for in northern Yellowstone, are abundant and very successful at particularly targeting elk calves. In one study, 60% of the marked elk calves that were documented to have died from bears. So bears were able to sniff them out, detect them, and gobble them up. And that, of course, is going to significantly impact your recruitment rates for your elk population. So bears, as their population has recovered on the landscape simultaneously with wolf reintroduction, has also had a significant impact on elk predation and numbers. Now, I mentioned earlier that along with wolves, mountain lions had been systematically eradicated from Yellowstone National Park back in the early 1920s and 1930s. But naturally, over the decades from the 1980s into the 1990s, we saw mountain lions begin to recover and return to Yellowstone National Park through migration, so natural recolonization of Yellowstone National Park. And in the 1990s, the population of mountain lions in the northern range increased by 76%. And as I just touched on, mountain lions are very efficient predators. And they're less selective when it comes to preying on elk and deer than wolves are, as wolves are pushing and pursuing their ungulates, their prey. They're bound to be selecting for individuals which again are going to be more vulnerable: the old, the weak, the sick, or just the clumsy, the ones that make a wrong move. But as ambush predators, mountain lions are less selective. They can ambush a prime-aged elk as well as a calf or a bull and efficiently subdue it and kill it by very quickly targeting its vital areas around its neck and its throat. This is a picture of Dan Staler, the Yellowstone lead biologist for the Cougar Project, Elk Project, and now Wolf Project in Yellowstone. We're still continually monitoring and trying to understand the complexity of interactions between mountain lions as they recover on the Yellowstone landscape with wolves. Now, something else that's fascinating to touch on is that even though mountain lions are perhaps the super predators, they're the most efficient killers on the landscape, they're pushovers when it comes to defending their kills. And both wolves and bears very often will chase mountain lions off of their kills. It's called kleptoparasitism. They steal the kills from mountain lions, and then they scavenge off of the hard-earned meal that the mountain lion secured for them. And in some cases, this means that the mountain lion has to hunt more frequently. So you have an efficient predator having to kill more regularly in order just to maintain its basic caloric needs. Interestingly, and conversely, wolves are pushovers to bears. Wolves will work very hard to bring down a meal. And then if bears, like grizzly bears, come along and they want the dinner that the wolves work so hard for, the wolves have to beat or retreat, and they back off and watch as, in frustration, as the bears will scavenge and devour their hard-earned meal. But contrary to what we see with mountain lions, there's actually not more predation by wolves on elk because of this, but less predation. Wolves, rather than risking a highly dangerous attack and pursuit of elk all over again, which is very costly and exhaustive, we see that wolves generally loiter around their stolen kills, waiting for the bears to finish, and hopefully going to pick up some of those scraps. So these two pictures taken by Dan Staler here from Yellowstone National Park illustrate that situation and the complexity that takes place when you have multiple large carnivores interacting on the landscape. I'm getting to the top of the hour here, but it's important that I plow through this, so bear with me. Now, we've talked about other large carnivores on the Yellowstone landscape. It's also incredibly important and very frequently overlooked that humans are predators on the landscape too. And elk populations in the northern range, as they grew and became more and more abundant, those populations began to migrate and shift outside of the national park boundaries. And just outside of Yellowstone National Park, there is a lot of agriculture, and elk were frustratingly depredating on haystacks and hay bales and alfalfa fields, much to the chagrin and frustration of ranchers and farmers in the valley just to the north of Yellowstone National Park. They acknowledged that there were a lot of elk, perhaps too many elk on the landscape, because not only were these animals denuding the landscape of the natural resources, but they were also raiding and taking over some of the hard-earned resources that ranchers and farmers had gathered to support their livestock just outside of the park. So to address this, the state of Montana, in addition to a typical fall hunt, initiated a late season hunt, which ran typically through the month of February. And this is a hunt, which is primarily targeting cow elk, not just your bull elk. If you're unfamiliar with hunting, generally, if you're trying to maintain your population, again, trying to have a maximum sustainable yield, you're targeting your males more than your females, again, because your females are the baby makers. But in this case, the Montana Parks and Wildlife wanted to target the breeding females because they understood that by removing breeding females, prime-aged cow elk, they could hopefully bring that elk population back down to a more reasonable number so that it was, again, not denuding the landscape of natural resources or competing with the ranchers and farmers. And so from 1995 to 2002, almost 1,000 to over 24,000, or excuse me, 2,400. Wow, that was a big misstep on my part, excuse me. 940 to 2,465 elk were annually harvested, and these were mostly cow elk being removed from the population. And based off of the annual average, that's almost 6 to 18% of the population of elk being removed by human hunters just outside of the park boundary at the same time that wolves are being reintroduced. To put that into perspective, wolves annually were hunting about 2 to 6% of the population at that time. This is a fascinating graph put out by the Park Service, which shows the age of death in adult elk female killed by wolves versus hunters. And you can see that elk are mostly older in age, above 16 is kind of the average that we're looking at for elk that are killed by wolves, whereas human hunters are, of course, selecting the more prime-aged individuals. Cow elk, which are, again, are going to be reproductively active. Now, in addition to a decreasing elk population, we suddenly saw an increase in our bison population all across northern Yellowstone. In fact, now if you go to Yellowstone, you see more bison than you do elk. The bison population, which was all but vanished at the turn of the 19th century and 20th century, has been doing fantastic. And this graph here marks that their numbers are now between 3,000 to 5,000 in the park at any given time. The management of bison in Yellowstone is a complex issue, and I've given a webinar on that. But there are a lot of bison which inevitably are going to be competing with elk for forage. So as the elk population has decreased, not only that, but you have more and more bison, which are in some cases perhaps outcompeting the elk population from rebounding to what it once was. And then most notably of all, which again is often overlooked, is the narrative of climate change. In the 1990s specifically, we had large droughts preceding the reintroduction of wolves. And then after wolves, we still are seeing the impacts and fluctuation of climate change in the northern range, which is going to inevitably impact vegetation and how it is distributed across this landscape. And one last caveat I've got to throw in is, as we talk about engineering ecosystems and whether or not wolves were the primary cause of changing the environment in Yellowstone, we have to take a pause and acknowledge that beavers, second only to humans, are perhaps the greatest ecosystem engineers. And again, left out of many popular narratives is the fact that just outside of Yellowstone, in the riparian systems just beyond the park's boundaries, from 1988 to 1999, wildlife managers were actively reintroducing beavers to these river systems. And beavers, of course, as they rebound, they're going to be creating ponds and dams, which increases the water table, which is going to help spur revegetation of willows and aspens. And this is happening at the same time that wolves are being reintroduced, and beavers are migrating into the park, as well as reestablishing colonies up and down the Lamar Valley. So as a quick recap, because we talked about so much, again, at the end of the 1800s, we saw our elk population become decimated. In response to that, large carnivores, especially wolves and mountain lions, were systematically eradicated from the park to help the elk population recover. And it did recover very quickly, to the point that we had to actively manage our elk population by culling the herds. And this happened up until 1969, when the National Park Service changed its management protocol, at which time the elk population grew exponentially to an all-time high in the 1990s. In the mid-1990s, wolves were reintroduced, but in addition to wolves being reintroduced, we also had mountain lion resurgence, grizzly bear recovery, and elk management by human harvest, which is ultimately impacting the population of elk. In addition to that, you're seeing a growing population of bison, recovering beavers, and climate change, which ultimately leads to a decline in our elk population. The elk population in northern Yellowstone today has rebounded and is around 6,000 to 7,000 individuals on the landscape, which seems to be a natural, steady equilibrium where we're at. We'll see where we're going to be in the next 50 years. Again, as predators are on the landscape and the dynamics of climate change shift the ecosystem. And it's important to tell this story because science is very complex. And I think it's important for us to understand the complexity and realize just how dynamic this matrix actually is when we're talking about wildlife and ecosystems. It's very rarely, if ever, just two characters on the playing field. We have everything from the microbes to the inanimate minerals and rocks and water systems, all the way up, of course, to your apex predators like the wolf. But everything is connected. Everything is extremely complex. And this is an important story to tell because there is no doubt that wolves significantly have benefited the ecosystem by fulfilling the role of a missing apex predator. And wolves have contributed to the health of the Yellowstone ecosystem. My point in sharing today's narrative is not to diminish the importance of having rich biodiversity on the landscape, but it's more important, if not at the very least equally important, for us to acknowledge that all species belong in the ecosystem, and it takes more than just one in order to keep that ecosystem's integrity intact. So thank goodness, not just for wolves on the landscape, but also thank goodness for your bears, your lions, for your beavers, and humans are a part of the ecosystem too. We always have been. And it's important to acknowledge the amount of influence we have over that ecosystem, for good or for bad, good if we so choose. Today, I again was presenting on tons of research collected by the Yellowstone Wolf Project over the last 30 years. This is a book that my previous supervisors and graduate advisor published in 2020. It contains all of this wonderful information, but in much better detail. And I encourage you to pick it up and study more about the impacts of wolves in Yellowstone National Park, our first national park. And I believe that is it. That's all I've got for today. So thanks so much for tuning in. Sorry I went over.
No worries, Aaron. It was absolutely fascinating, and you definitely tackled a lot of the questions. But if there are any more, feel free to submit them via the question field in your control panel. It's the upper right-hand corner. Go ahead and click on those three lines, and that's where the questions will live. So let me ask you this. How often will wolves also hunt mule deer?
They will hunt mule deer and white-tailed deer, and it really depends upon the system that they're in. So, for example, in the Midwest, wolves primarily are targeting white-tailed deer because there aren't elk, and the moose are more challenging in many cases for the wolves to tackle. So it really depends upon the system, but where there are elk are the preferred prey species for several reasons. One is because they're a bigger package. It's a lot of work to chase 100-pound to 150-pound mule deer. And once you catch it, that meal is not going to last you nearly as long as an elk would last you. And also behaviorally, mule deer tend to not herd up in as large of groups as elk. And so you're going to pursue them. It's going to be harder to catch them. They scatter like buckshot. Behaviorally, elk gather in large herds. And so you're able to pursue them as a group longer, and the odds of you finding one that's going to slip up is increased. So when you have elk on the landscape, they are generally the preferred prey source for wolves. But when there are no elk, then wolves will eat mule deer.
So what role do fires in the park play in the survival of the wolves?
Well, fire is an important component of the ecosystem, and that was one of the changes made by the natural regulation policy change in 1969, is taking a faith jump in trying to understand the ecological importance of fires. And this was really put to the test in 1988 when the large fires burned through Yellowstone National Park. 36% of the park was consumed. Fires help to generate habitat. They open up potentially for more areas for sunlight to reach the forest floor, which increases the vegetation that is many herbivores depend upon, which increases their abundance, which therefore increases the predator abundance as well. So fires are important as a part of that system.
Great, thank you. Is there any animal in Yellowstone that the wolves will avoid?
Yes, I mean, they avoid other wolves generally, but they also avoid bears, both black bears and grizzly bears. With black bears, it's a little bit of a toss-up, and sure, every now and then you'll see something on the internet or YouTube of someone who witnessed wolves and grizzly bears interacting, but generally speaking, wolves avoid grizzly bears. They're big and they're bad, and they can kill wolf pups in particular.
Gotcha. So has the increased tourism affected the animals in the park at all?
No, in some ways. I mean, yes, and others. You have 5 million people visiting Yellowstone National Park every year. That's bound to leave some form of footprint behind. It definitely creates habituation for the wildlife. I've worked with wild bison populations, for example, and they behave very differently than your bison in Yellowstone, which if you've been to Yellowstone, you're familiar with the bison jams. Bison just loiter all over the roads. They're not scared of people. Neither are the elk. But in a wild system with fewer people, or in places where these animals are harvested, of course, they're going to be shyer.
Gotcha. So what is your opinion of wolf preserves or refuge, I'm sorry. And would it be correct to assume that the wolves there cannot survive in the wild on their own?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of, it's kind of hard to lump all wolf sanctuaries or refuges into the same box because there's varying degrees of credibility that each sanctuary can have. They're vary. But yeah, if you have a large carnivore which has been kept in captivity because it was rescued from the wild, or because it became habituated to people, or was a threat to people, or something like that, those animals cannot be returned to the wild. They become too dependent upon human care, and again, too habituated to humans to ever be really seriously reintroduced. Now, there are, I mean, like when wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park, the first year they were kept in 1 acre holding pens, but there was very little human involvement. Humans were not present. It was to maintain, again, that kind of alienation from wolves and humans. And so again, it's tough to lump all sanctuaries or rehabilitation centers into the same category. It all depends on their mission and what they're doing, and the validity of how they're operating.
Fair enough. Well, thank you, Aaron. Unfortunately, that is going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'm going to throw it back to you for any closing comments you may want to share with us.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. It was a big subject, and I was aware that I was biting off a lot. So hopefully I didn't lose anyone. Again, all I'd like to say at the conclusion of this is just the natural world is a wonderful and a complex place. And wolves are an important component of the ecosystem, but biodiversity in all of its various forms are so important for everything to function appropriately in a healthy way. And thanks for tuning in today.
Aaron, based on the comments we're getting, people were very happy to spend the extra time with us. So thank you for taking that time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who joined us today. So if you are interested in information on how you can travel to Yellowstone with NatHab, please give us a call at 800-543-8917 or send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and the replay will be on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.